Blood trickled down Nora O'Malley's chin as Victor Elliott watched in horror from across the dusty street of Sierra City, California. 1876, the same street where he'd first laid eyes on her bruised face 3 months earlier, and silently vowed that somehow, someday, he would help her escape. Nora dabbed at her split lip with a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously toward the general store where her husband, Frank O'Malley, was purchasing ammunition. Her bonnet cast shadows across her face, but couldn't hide the yellowing bruise beneath her right eye. She walked with practiced care, each step measured to avoid aggravating what Victor suspected were broken ribs beneath her corseted dress. Sierra City had boomed during the gold rush years, but by '76 had settled into a quieter existence, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains where lumber mills and the remaining mines kept the town alive. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, yet somehow Nora's suffering remained hidden in plain sight, or perhaps more accurately, deliberately ignored. Victor adjusted his worn leather vest and ran a hand through his sun-bleached brown hair. At 32, he'd spent 15 years driving cattle, breaking horses, and taking whatever honest work came his way. He wasn't the type to interfere in another man's marriage, but the sight of Nora's battered face haunted him at night. "Miss Nora," he said quietly as he approached, tipping his hat, "might I assist you with your packages?" Her eyes green as summer grass flashed with fear. "Mr. Elliott, I cannot. Frank will be out any moment. Just to your wagon, madam." He kept his voice gentle, the way he would speak to a spooked horse. "Nothing improper." Nora glanced toward the store, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Victor took the parcel from her trembling hands. "My husband," she whispered. "He had a difficult night at the tables." "And you paid the price," Victor said, his jaw tightening. "It is a wife's duty to bear her husband's burdens," she recited, though the words sounded hollow. They reached the wagon, and Victor placed her package inside. He noticed fresh blood on her handkerchief and fought to control his anger. "No one deserves to bear that burden, Miss Nora," he said quietly. "No one." She looked up at him then, and for a brief moment something flickered in her eyes, a spark of something long forgotten. Hope, perhaps, or rebellion. "You talk like a man who's never known his place," she said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "And you," Victor replied, "like a woman who's forgotten hers isn't beneath a man's fist." The saloon doors banged open across the street, and Frank O'Malley emerged, his bulky frame swaying slightly from morning whiskey. Nora's face instantly transformed, all emotion vanishing behind a mask of wifely submission. "Good day, Mr. Elliott," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "Thank you for your assistance." Victor tipped his hat again and stepped away, but not before whispering, "If you ever need help, I work at the Carter Ranch, 3 miles east." Frank stumbled toward them, his face flushed with alcohol and suspicion. "What's this, then?" "My wife needs no assistance from saddle tramps." "Just being neighborly, Mr. O'Malley," Victor replied evenly, though inside his blood boiled. Frank spat on the ground near Victor's boots. "Keep your neighborliness away from my wife, Cowboy." Victor nodded stiffly and walked away, feeling Nora's eyes on his back. He'd made an enemy today, but more importantly, he'd planted a seed. Whether it would grow remained to be seen. That night, as Victor sat on the porch of the bunkhouse at the Carter Ranch, smoking his evening cigarette and watching the stars emerge above the mountains, he couldn't shake the image of Nora's face. 26, she'd told him once during a brief conversation at the general store. 26, and married 7 years to a man who'd promised her the moon and given her only pain. "Thinking deep thoughts?" asked Samuel Parker, the ranch foreman, as he settled into the chair beside Victor. "Just counting stars," Victor lied. Counting bruises on Frank O'Malley's wife, more like, Samuel said knowingly. Half the county's seen how he treats her, and nobody does a thing about it. Samuel sighed. Law says a man can discipline his wife as he sees fit. Law's wrong, Victor said firmly. Won't argue that. But be careful, Vic. Frank's connected. His cousin's the sheriff and his brother-in-law's the judge in Nevada City. Men have disappeared for less than coveting his property. She's not property, Victor growled. She's a person. I know that, you know that, but to Frank, she's just another possession, like his horse or his pocket watch. Samuel stood, stretching his aging back. Just watch yourself. Helping a woman escape her husband, that's the kind of thing that gets a man killed in these parts. After Samuel went inside, Victor remained on the porch, weighing his conscience against his survival. He'd never considered himself particularly brave or noble. He'd fought when necessary, worked hard, lived honestly. But he'd never risked his life for a stranger. Yet Nora O'Malley wasn't exactly a stranger anymore. In the 3 months since he'd taken the job at Carter's ranch, their paths had crossed perhaps a dozen times in town. Brief encounters at the general store, the post office, outside church on Sundays. Small conversations, nothing inappropriate. But he'd seen the intelligence in her eyes, the dignity with which she carried herself despite her circumstances. And he'd seen those same eyes dim with each new bruise, each new humiliation. Victor extinguished his cigarette and made his decision. If she asked for help, he would give it consequences be damned. 2 weeks passed before Victor saw Nora again. Sierra City was preparing for its annual Founders' Day celebration, and the streets were busier than usual as he rode into town for supplies. He spotted her outside the dressmaker's shop, and his heart clenched. Her face was clear of bruises for once, but she walked with a pronounced limp. As their eyes met across the street, a sudden commotion erupted from the saloon. Frank O'Malley staggered out, embroiled in a heated argument with another man. The dispute quickly escalated, and within moments, both men had drawn pistols. Gunfight. Someone yelled and people scattered for cover. Victor saw Nora frozen in place, directly in the potential line of fire. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward, galloping the short distance to her side. He leaned down, extended his arm, and in one fluid motion, pulled her up behind him. "Hold tight," he shouted as she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. Just as the first shot rang out, Victor wheeled his horse around and galloped toward the edge of town. He felt Nora trembling against his back, her grip desperate. "My husband will kill us both," she gasped once they'd reached the cover of trees along the road. "He's too busy trying not to get himself killed at the moment," Victor replied, slowing his horse to a walk. "I'll have you back before he notices, if that's what you want." She was silent for a long moment, her breath warm against his shoulder. Finally, she said, "What if? What if it isn't what I want?" Victor reined in his horse and turned to look at her. "Then tell me what you do want, Nora." "I don't know," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "To breathe without fear, to sleep without dread, to look in a mirror and recognize myself again." "I can help you," he said quietly. "But it would mean leaving everything, everyone," she laughed bitterly. "I have nothing, no one. Frank made sure of that years ago. It would be dangerous," Victor warned. "He'd come looking," he would, she agreed. "And if he found me, he'd kill me." "He's promised as much many times." Victor considered their options. "I have friends in Oregon, people who could help." The sound of more gunshots from town interrupted them. Nora flinched, her fingers digging into Victor's arm. "Take me back," she said suddenly, her voice firm despite her obvious fear. "I can't, not like this, not unprepared." Victor wanted to argue but knew she was right. Running with nothing but the clothes on her back would only make things harder. "When?" he asked. Founder's Day, she replied after a moment's thought. This Saturday. Frank will be deep in his cups by nightfall. I can meet you at midnight at the old Miller barn east of town. I'll be there, Victor promised. Bring only what you can carry easily. He turned the horse back toward town, conscious of her warmth against him, the trust she was placing in him. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about giving her a chance at the life she deserved. They rode in silence until the outskirts of Sierra City came into view. The gunfight appeared to be over. People were cautiously returning to the streets. "Let me down here," Nora said. "I need to be seen returning alone." Victor helped her dismount, steadying her as her injured leg nearly gave way. "Saturday," she whispered. "Midnight." "I'll be waiting," he replied. "Be careful, Nora." She nodded and limped back toward town, instantly transforming back into the submissive wife of Frank O'Malley. Victor watched until she disappeared around a corner, then turned his horse toward the ranch, his mind racing with plans and preparations. The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation and fear. Victor carefully gathered supplies, secreting them away in his saddlebags. He arranged with Samuel to take some personal time after the Founder's Day celebration, being deliberately vague about his plans. "This have anything to do with a certain lady in town?" Samuel asked shrewdly. "Best you don't know," Victor replied. Samuel nodded slowly. "Best I don't, but Vic, if you need anything, I know where to find you," Victor finished with a grateful smile. Saturday arrived with perfect late spring weather. Victor joined the other ranch hands in town for the celebration, keeping a careful distance from both Nora and Frank while maintaining awareness of their locations. Frank, as predicted, was methodically drinking himself into a state at the Golden Nugget Saloon, while Nora moved gracefully through the festivities, her social mask firmly in place. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit around the town square for the evening dancing, Victor slipped away to prepare. He collected his horse from the livery stable. Along with a second mount, he'd purchased a gentle mare suited for a lady rider who might not have much experience in the saddle. Then he rode to the appointed meeting place to wait. The Miller barn had been abandoned for years, its owner having succumbed to fever back in '71. It stood a ghostly sentinel in the moonlight, its weathered boards silver against the dark hills beyond. Victor settled the horses inside and checked his pocket watch for the dozenth time. 2 hours yet until midnight. He passed the time checking and rechecking his preparations. Food, water, ammunition, money sewn into the lining of his jacket, maps of the routes north, a letter of introduction to his friends in Oregon. Everything a person would need to start a new life. The sound of approaching hoofbeats an hour before the appointed time sent Victor reaching for his revolver. He peered cautiously through a crack in the barn wall and exhaled with relief when he recognized Nora's slight figure hurrying toward the barn, a small bundle clutched to her chest. "Victor," she called softly as she entered. "Here," he replied, stepping from the shadows. "You're early." Frank passed out sooner than expected. Her eyes were wide with fear and excitement. "I left a note saying I'd gone to visit a sick friend. It won't fool him for long. It doesn't need to. By dawn, we'll be miles from here." He took her bundle and secured it to the mare's saddle. "Can you ride?" "Not well," she admitted, "but I can stay on a horse." "This is Daisy," he said, introducing her to the gentle mare. "She'll take good care of you." As Nora stroked the horse's nose, Victor noticed she wore men's trousers beneath her shortened skirt. "Scandalized?" she asked, catching his glance. "Impressed," he corrected with a smile. "Practical." "I've had years to think about running away," Nora said quietly. "I've planned for everything except—" She looked up at him. "Except having help." Victor felt something tighten in his chest. "We should go. The night's wasting." He helped her mount, then swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of the barn and turned north, keeping to the tree line rather than the main road. The first few miles passed in tense silence, both listening for any sound of pursuit. When they crossed the county line, Nora let out a small laugh, quickly stifled. "Something funny?" Victor asked. "I've never been outside Nevada County before," she replied. "Frank wouldn't allow it." "Well, we're headed a lot farther than just the next county," Victor said. "How do you feel about Oregon?" "I don't know anything about it," Nora admitted. "It's green, rains a lot, good farmland." "Different laws," he glanced at her. "Safer laws for women." She absorbed this information silently, then asked, "Why are you doing this, Victor? Risking everything for someone you barely know?" He considered her question carefully. "I've seen a lot of cruelty in my life. Done nothing about most of it. Told myself it wasn't my business." He adjusted his hat. "I'm tired of looking the other way." "Is that all?" she pressed. Victor smiled slightly. "Isn't that enough?" "I suppose it is," she conceded, though her tone suggested she suspected there was more to it. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, following game trails and logging roads rather than the main thoroughfares. Victor led them to a small clearing near a creek, well hidden from any nearby trails. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he announced. "Get some sleep while I keep watch." Nora dismounted stiffly, wincing as her injured leg took her weight. Victor was at her side instantly, supporting her elbow. "How bad is it?" he asked, nodding toward her leg. "Broken, I think," she admitted. "Though it's been 3 weeks, so it's healing." "He broke your leg." Victor couldn't keep the horror from his voice. "I fell down the stairs," she replied with bitter irony. "At least, that's what he told Dr. Wilson and what Dr. Wilson chose to believe." Victor helped her to a comfortable spot beneath a pine tree. "We should properly splint it when we have time." "You know how to set bones?" she asked. "You learn a lot of things on the trail," he replied, spreading a blanket for her. "Rest now. I'll wake you if there's trouble." She settled onto the blanket, and despite her obvious exhaustion, her eyes remained alert. "What if he finds us?" Victor checked his revolver. "He won't." "But if he does?" "Then I'll handle it," he said firmly. "Sleep, Nora, you're safe." Perhaps it was the conviction in his voice, or simply the overwhelming fatigue of their flight, but Nora's eyes finally closed. Victor watched as her breathing steadied into sleep, the worry lines in her face softening. In repose, with the morning light filtering through the pine boughs above, she looked younger, almost peaceful. Victor allowed himself to really look at her for the first time, the copper highlights in her brown hair, the faint freckles across her nose, the surprising strength in her delicate hands. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the resilience he glimpsed beneath her fragility that truly drew him. Victor settled with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, and prepared for his vigil. They had at least 100 miles to go before they reached the Oregon border, and Frank O'Malley would certainly be in pursuit by now. The real journey was just beginning. Midday came and went as Victor maintained his watch. The forest around them remained quiet except for the occasional bird call and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. He allowed Nora to sleep, knowing she needed to rebuild her strength for the long journey ahead. Finally, as the sun began its westward descent, she stirred, blinking in momentary confusion before her eyes found Victor. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, sitting up. "About 6 hours," he replied. "How's the leg?" She stretched it cautiously. "Stiff but bearable." Victor retrieved some jerky and biscuits from his saddlebag, along with a canteen of water. "Not much of a meal, but it'll keep us going." Nora accepted the food gratefully. "Better than many meals I've had lately," she said. "Frank often forgot to leave money for provisions when he went on his gambling trips." Victor's jaw tightened, but he kept his anger in check. We'll need to be moving again soon. Are you up for it? She nodded, determination evident in her eyes. I've endured worse than a hard ride. As they ate, Victor spread his map on the ground between them. We're here, he said, pointing to their approximate location. I figure Frank will expect us to head straight north toward Oregon, so instead, we'll go northwest for a while through these hills before turning north again here. His finger traced the planned route. It's longer but less likely to be where he searches first. How do you know he's searching at all? Nora asked. Victor gave her a level look. Would he let you go without a fight? She shook her head slowly. No. His pride wouldn't allow it even if he didn't want me anymore. She looked down at her hands. I'm his possession, not his wife, at least not in the ways that matter. You're neither now, Victor reminded her gently. You're just Nora. She looked up, startled. I haven't been just Nora in so long, I'm not sure I remember how. You'll remember, he assured her, or discover it anew. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then prepared to continue their journey. Victor helped Nora onto her horse, trying to be mindful of her injury. Thank you, she said softly as his hands lingered at her waist, steadying her. For everything. Their eyes met, and Victor felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection that went beyond the circumstance that had brought them together. He stepped back, suddenly conscious of the impropriety. We should reach Johnson's Creek by nightfall, he said, changing the subject. There's an old trapper's cabin there where we can shelter properly. They rode for another 4 hours, the terrain growing steadily more challenging as they entered the foothills. Nora proved to be a better rider than she'd claimed, maintaining a steady seat despite her injury and the difficult path. As promised, they reached Johnson's Creek just as dusk was settling. The trapper's cabin was little more than a one-room shack with a stone fireplace, but it offered solid walls and a roof luxuries after a day on the trail. It's not much, Victor apologized as he helped Nora dismount. It's perfect, she replied, limping toward the cabin's entrance. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot were the only furnishings. Victor quickly set about building a small fire in the fireplace while Nora explored their temporary shelter. How did you know this was here? She asked, running her hand along the rough-hewn table. Drove cattle through these hills a few years back, he explained. Old man Johnson was still alive then. He passed last winter, according to the gossip in Sierra City. The fire caught, sending welcome warmth through the cabin. Victor retrieved their saddlebags and the small bundle Nora had brought. What did you bring? He asked curiously. She opened the bundle to reveal a few practical items. A change of clothes, a hairbrush, a small book of poetry. But nestled among these was something unexpected, a gleaming revolver. Frank's backup pistol, she explained. He never noticed I took it months ago. Victor raised an eyebrow. You know how to use it. I grew up with 3 brothers, she replied with a hint of pride. I could outshoot them all by the time I was 16. Full of surprises, aren't you? Victor said with new respect. You have to understand, she said, her expression turning serious. I wasn't always this, afraid, broken. She touched her injured leg. Before Frank, I was different. Tell me, Victor encouraged, settling into one of the chairs. Nora sat across from him, the firelight casting dancing shadows across her face. My father had a small ranch near Grass Valley. Nothing fancy, just enough cattle to keep us fed and clothed. My mother died when I was 12, so I learned to manage a household young. My brothers taught me to ride, shoot, even mend fences. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Father said I was worth any 2 of my brothers for work and prettier besides. What happened? Victor asked softly. Father died when I was 19. The ranch went to my oldest brother who had a wife and children by then. There wasn't room or resources for everyone, so my other brothers headed to the gold fields, and I. She paused. I met Frank in Nevada City. He was charming then, handsome, successful. He promised me the world, and delivered hell instead, Victor finished. Nora nodded. The first time he hit me was 6 months after our wedding. I'd burned the roast. Her voice was steady, matter of fact. He apologized so beautifully afterward, brought me flowers, cried. Promised it would never happen again. But it did, more and more frequently, and worse each time. She touched her face unconsciously, as if feeling phantom bruises. Eventually, there were no more apologies, no more flowers, just punishment for imagined offenses. She looked directly at Victor. Do you know what the worst part was? He shook his head, unable to find words adequate for her pain. The worst part was forgetting who I used to be, forgetting that I once had dreams, opinions, laughter. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. He didn't just break my body, he broke my spirit. Victor reached across the table and took her hand. Not completely, he said firmly. You're here, you escaped, that took courage. It took desperation, she corrected. And you. Their eyes held for a long moment. Victor was acutely aware of her hand in his, the softness of her skin against his calloused palm. He released her hand reluctantly. You should take the cot, he said, standing. I'll keep watch. You need rest too, she protested. I'll catch a few hours before dawn, he promised. Used to riding night, heard I can function on less sleep than most. Nora looked like she wanted to argue, but instead nodded and moved toward the cot. She removed her boots, but kept her clothes on, obviously uncomfortable with the idea of undressing with Victor present. I'll step outside while you settle in, he offered, heading for the door. The night air was cool and crisp, stars brilliant in the black velvet sky. Victor breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. The intensity of his feelings for Nora troubled him. She was vulnerable, dependent on him for safety. The last thing she needed was another man presuming to have a claim on her. After a few minutes, the cabin door opened and Nora called softly, "You can come back in now." She was tucked beneath the thin blanket on the cot, her hair loose around her shoulders. Victor averted his eyes, focusing on stoking the fire. "Victor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens when we reach Oregon?" He considered her question carefully. "My friends there, the Bennetts, they own a small farm outside of Portland. Good people. They've offered to help settle you somewhere safe, maybe find you work as a school teacher or shopkeeper. And you? What will you do?" Victor shrugged. "Head back south, I suppose, find work on another ranch." "Oh," the single syllable contained a wealth of emotion. "I just assumed." "That I'd stay," Victor finished. "Nora, you're just beginning to find freedom. The last thing you need is to feel obligated to another man." "Is that what you think? That I'd feel obligated?" She sat up, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. "Victor, you're not Frank. You're nothing like him." "Even so," he said gently, "you deserve time to heal, to rediscover yourself without complications." She studied him for a long moment. "And if I decided that I wanted complications?" The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Victor forced himself to be the voice of reason. "Then I'd still say wait, heal, be sure." He smiled to soften his words. "I'm not going anywhere that I can't come back from." Nora nodded slowly, accepting his wisdom even as disappointment flickered in her eyes. "Good night then, Victor." "Good night, Nora, sleep well." She lay down again, turning her face toward the wall. Victor settled into the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, and prepared for his night watch. Outside, an owl called mournfully, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. They were up before dawn, eating a cold breakfast as they prepared to continue their journey. Nora seemed quieter than the previous day, though whether from pain, exhaustion, or their conversation the night before, Victor couldn't tell. "We'll make for Basker's Ridge today," he informed her as they saddled the horses. "There's a small settlement there where we can resupply." "Is it safe?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Safer than backtracking," Victor replied. "We need food and fresh water, and your leg needs proper tending." Nora nodded, accepting his assessment. They mounted up and set off just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The day's ride was arduous, the trail winding steeply through pine-covered hills. By midday, Victor could see that Nora was struggling, though she made no complaint. Her face was pale and she held herself rigidly in the saddle. "Let's rest here," he suggested, reining in beside a small stream. Relief flashed across her face as she nodded. Victor helped her dismount and settle on a fallen log while he watered the horses. "How much farther to this settlement?" she asked as he handed her the canteen. "Another 3 hours, maybe 4 at our current pace." He studied her with concern. "We can stop for the day if you need to." "No," she said firmly. "I can continue, I just needed a short rest." Victor knelt before her, looking up into her face. "Nora, there's no shame in acknowledging pain." She smiled wryly. "Old habits die hard. Frank hated weakness." "I'm not Frank," he reminded her gently. "And pain isn't weakness." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, kneeling beside a mountain stream in the wilderness. Then the crack of a rifle shot shattered the stillness. "Down!" Victor shouted, pulling Nora to the ground and covering her body with his own as another shot splintered the bark of a nearby tree. "Frank?" she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Can't tell," Victor replied, drawing his revolver. "Stay low." He crawled to the edge of the clearing, peering cautiously through the underbrush. A movement caught his eye, a man in a buckskin jacket, rifle raised, approximately 50 yards upstream. "Not Frank," Victor reported, relief evident in his voice. "Looks like a trapper or prospector." He stood slowly, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Hello, the creek," he called. "We mean no harm." The man hesitated, then lowered his rifle slightly. "Identify yourself," he shouted back. "Victor Elliott. My companion and I are traveling to Basker's Ridge." The man approached cautiously, his rifle still at the ready. He was an older fellow, perhaps 60, with a grizzled beard and weather-beaten face. "Didn't expect company in these parts," he said by way of explanation. "Thought you might be claim jumpers." "Just passing through," Victor assured him. "Is the trail to Basker's Ridge still clear?" The old man spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Clear enough, but you won't find much there now." "What do you mean?" "Fever came through last month. Half the settlement's dead or gone." He eyed Nora, who had risen to stand beside Victor. "No doctor there now, if that's what you're looking for." Victor felt his heart sink. He'd been counting on finding medical attention for Nora's leg. "Any other settlements nearby?" "Riverside's a day's ride west," the old man offered. "They've got a proper doctor." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "Appreciate the information, friend." The old prospector hesitated, then said, "Got a cabin a half-mile upstream. Nothing fancy, but you and your wife are welcome to a hot meal before you continue." Before Victor could correct the man's assumption, Nora stepped forward. "That's very kind of you, sir. We'd be grateful." The old man introduced himself as Henry Sutter, a prospector who'd been working these hills for nearly 20 years. His cabin was indeed modest but clean and well-maintained. "Been meaning to head into Basker's Ridge myself," Henry explained as he stirred a pot of savory stew over the fire. "Lucky I was delayed, or I might have caught the fever too." As they ate, Victor explained their situation, a sanitized version that described Nora as his sister-in-law, recently widowed, whom he was escorting to relatives in Oregon. "Dangerous country for a lady," Henry commented. eyeing Nora's splinted leg. "How'd that happen?" "Fell from her horse back near Sierra City," Victor lied smoothly. "Been healing poorly on the trail." Henry nodded sagely. "Need to get her to that doctor in Riverside for sure." He considered for a moment. "Tell you what, I know these hills better than most. I can guide you there by a quicker route than circling through Basker's Ridge." Victor exchanged glances with Nora. The offer was tempting but potentially risky. Could they trust this stranger? "That's very generous," Victor said cautiously. "Been alone too long," Henry admitted with a shrug. Company would be welcome for a spell. After some discussion, they agreed to accept Henry's guidance. They would rest at his cabin for the remainder of the day and set out for Riverside at dawn. As dusk fell, Henry excused himself to check his traps, leaving Victor and Nora alone in the cabin. The moment the door closed behind him, Nora turned to Victor. "Can we trust him?" she whispered urgently. "I believe so," Victor replied, "but we'll stay vigilant. Keep your revolver close tonight." Nora nodded, absently rubbing her injured leg. Victor noticed her discomfort. "Let me have a look at that," he offered. "I'm no doctor, but I might be able to adjust the splint to make it more comfortable." She hesitated, then nodded, extending her leg toward him. Victor carefully rolled up her trouser leg, revealing the crude splint she'd fashioned herself. The skin around it was inflamed and swollen. "This needs proper medical attention," he said grimly. "Riverside can't come soon enough, will it?" She swallowed hard. "Will I lose the leg?" "No," Victor said firmly, though he wasn't entirely certain. "But you'll need to stay off it as much as possible until we reach the doctor." He rewrapped the splint more securely, his touch gentle as he worked. Nora watched his hands, strong yet tender as they moved over her injury. "You have healer's hands," she observed quietly. Victor looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Just experienced hands, done this more than once on the trail." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary. Victor cleared his throat and lowered her trouser leg, restoring propriety. "We should both rest while we can," he suggested, moving away from her. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Henry returned shortly after, carrying 2 rabbits for the next day's journey. He insisted Victor take his bed while he and Nora used bedrolls on the floor, an arrangement that Victor reluctantly accepted only after confirming that Nora was comfortable with the plan. As he lay in the darkness listening to the gentle breathing of his companions, Victor reflected on how quickly their situation had changed. The addition of Henry to their party altered the dynamic considerably, offering both additional security and new complications. If Frank tracked them this far, 3 would certainly stand a better chance than 2. But Victor also recognized that Henry's presence created a buffer between himself and Nora, perhaps necessarily so. His feelings for her were growing stronger with each passing day, despite his best efforts to maintain a respectful distance. He admired her courage, her resilience in the face of tremendous adversity. And yes, he was attracted to her beauty, both physical and spiritual. But she deserved time and space to heal, to rediscover herself without the complication of another man's desire. With these thoughts circling in his mind, Victor finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. They departed at first light, Henry leading them along game trails that didn't appear on any map. The old prospector set a careful pace, mindful of Nora's injury, stopping frequently to allow her to rest. "Your sister-in-law's a strong woman," Henry commented to Victor during one such break, as Nora rested by a stream. "Most ladies would be complaining non-stop with a break like that." "She comes from hardy stock," Victor replied, maintaining their cover story. Henry studied him for a moment. "She ain't really your sister-in-law, is she?" Victor stiffened. "Why would you say that? Way you look at her ain't brotherly," Henry observed shrewdly. and way she looks at you definitely ain't sisterly." Rather than deny it, Victor sighed. "It's complicated. Usually is with womenfolk," Henry agreed. "Running from something ain't you or someone." "Would it matter if we were?" Henry spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Not to me. Had my share of running in my day." Victor decided to trust the old man with a version of the truth. "Her husband's an abusive bastard. I'm helping her get away from him." Henry nodded as if this confirmed his suspicions. "Figured it was something like that." "Leg didn't get that way from no fall off a horse." "He'll be looking for us," Victor warned. "Let him look," Henry replied with surprising vehemence. "Man who raises his hand to a woman deserves whatever trouble comes his way." By mid-afternoon, the terrain had changed, the dense pine forest giving way to more open country as they descended toward the valley where Riverside was located. They stopped at the crest of a hill, gazing down at the settlement below, larger than Sierra City, with perhaps 50 buildings clustered around a central street. "Riverside," Henry announced. "Founded after the rush of '49, but really grew during the war when they discovered copper in the hills beyond." "Looks prosperous," Victor observed. "Mining town," Henry confirmed. "Rough in parts, but they've got a proper doctor, a hotel, even a small theater." They made their way down the hillside, reaching the outskirts of town as the sun began its westward descent. Victor was acutely aware of the risk they were taking by entering a settlement of this size. Word traveled fast in mining communities, and Frank might have connections here. "Know a place where we can get lodging without too many questions?" Victor asked Henry. "Widow Caldwell runs a boarding house on the edge of town," Henry replied. "Respectable, but not too prying, and not the first place a man would look if he came asking questions." They made their way to the boarding house, a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a well-tended garden. Rose Caldwell proved to be a handsome woman of about 50 who greeted Henry like an old friend. "These are my traveling companions," Henry introduced them. "Mr. and Mrs. Elliott, heading north to Oregon." Victor started at the unexpected introduction but quickly recovered, nodding politely. Nora, despite her evident fatigue, managed a gracious smile. "We have one room available," Mrs. Caldwell informed them, eyeing Nora's condition with concern. "With a proper bed for the lady. You gentlemen will need to make do with the floor, I'm afraid." "That's more than generous," Victor assured her. "My wife needs to see the doctor as soon as possible. Is he nearby?" "Dr. Peterson's office is just down the street," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "But he makes evening calls here at 6 o'clock. If you can wait an hour, you won't need to move her again today." Relief washed over Nora's face at this news. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That would be wonderful, Mrs." Caldwell showed them to their room, a modest but clean chamber with a comfortable-looking bed, a washstand, and a small sitting area. Once alone, Victor turned to Henry. "Mr. and Mrs. Elliott," the old prospector shrugged, "seemed simpler. Less questions that way." Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I don't mind," she said quietly. "As you pointed out, it's safer." Victor helped her remove her boots while Henry tactfully busied himself arranging their belongings. The domesticity of the moment wasn't lost on any of them. "I'll see about getting us some hot food," Henry announced, heading for the door, "and maybe learn what news has traveled this far from Sierra City." After he'd gone, an awkward silence fell between Victor and Nora. The pretense of marriage, even just for their cover story, had shifted the dynamic between them yet again. "I'm sorry about the deception," Victor finally said. "Henry was just trying to help." "I know," Nora replied, "and he's right, it is simpler." She looked up at Victor, a question in her eyes. "Unless it makes you uncomfortable." "My comfort isn't the priority," he deflected. "How's the leg?" she grimaced. Painful, but I'll manage until the doctor arrives. Victor filled the basin with water from the pitcher on the washstand. Let me help you clean up a bit before he comes. He brought the basin to her bedside along with a clean cloth. With gentle hands, he wiped the trail dust from her face and hands, his touch clinical yet tender. Nora closed her eyes, surrendering to his ministrations. No one has cared for me like this in a very long time, she murmured. Victor's hands stilled. Everyone deserves care, Nora, even broken things, she asked, her eyes still closed. You're not broken, he said firmly. Wounded, yes, but healing. She opened her eyes then, gazing directly into his. Because of you. The air between them charged with unspoken emotion. Victor pulled back slightly, maintaining the boundary he'd established for both their sakes. The doctor will be here soon, he said, returning the basin to the washstand. You should rest until then. A soft knock at the door interrupted any further conversation. It was Mrs. Caldwell with a tray of tea and biscuits. Thought you might need refreshment while waiting for the doctor, she said kindly. Her eyes took in the scene, Victor standing awkwardly by the washstand, Nora sitting on the edge of the bed. Is everything all right? Yes, thank you, Victor assured her. Just tired from the journey. Mrs. Caldwell nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Doctor Peterson should be here shortly. He's a good man, served as an army surgeon during the war. After she left, Victor poured tea for Nora, helping her hold the cup when her hands trembled with fatigue. They were still thus engaged when Henry returned, his expression troubled. What is it? Victor asked immediately. Henry closed the door before answering. Word from the north. Man fitting Frank O'Malley's description was asking questions in Basker's Ridge 2 days ago. Nora's teacup clattered against its saucer. He's following us. Following a trail, Henry corrected. But it's a cold one. He headed north from Basker's Ridge, thinking you continued that way. For now, Victor said grimly, but he'll double back when he realizes we're not ahead of him. All the more reason to get you healed up quick, Henry said to Nora, and moving again as soon as possible. Another knock announced the arrival of Dr. Peterson, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a neat gray beard. He entered carrying his medical bag, his manner brisk yet gentle. Mrs. Elliott, I understand you have an injury that needs attention. Victor and Henry excused themselves, stepping into the hallway to give Nora privacy during her examination. They waited in tense silence, both acutely aware of the urgency of their situation. After what seemed an eternity, the doctor emerged, his expression serious. The break was never properly set, he informed them. I've realigned it as best I could and applied a proper splint, but she'll need complete bed rest for at least a week, preferably 2. A week, Victor repeated, dismayed. Doctor, that may not be possible. Dr. Peterson's eyes narrowed. Without proper rest, she risks permanent disability. The bone is already attempting to heal incorrectly. Victor exchanged glances with Henry. They couldn't stay in Riverside for a week, not with Frank potentially on their trail. But continuing with Nora in her current condition wasn't an option either. Is she able to receive visitors? Victor asked. Briefly, the doctor consented. I've given her laudanum for the pain, so she'll be drowsy. They returned to find Nora propped up on pillows, her leg now properly splinted and elevated. Her face was pale but composed. Doctor says you need rest, Victor said gently, sitting beside her. We can't stay, she replied, her voice slurred slightly from the medication. Frank will find us. Let me worry about that, Victor soothed. For now, you need to sleep. Her eyes were already drooping, but she fought to keep them open. Don't leave me, she whispered. I won't, he promised. I'll be right here when you wake up. Satisfied with his assurance, Nora surrendered to the medication's effects, her breathing deepening into sleep. Victor brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch feather light. "You love her," Henry observed quietly. Victor didn't deny it. "Doesn't matter. She needs freedom more than she needs another man making claims on her." "Sometimes freedom and love ain't mutually exclusive," Henry pointed out. "But that's for later. Right now, we need a plan." They moved to the small sitting area by the window to discuss their options. Staying in Riverside was dangerous, but moving Nora would be equally risky given her condition. "What about hiding somewhere closer?" Victor suggested. "Somewhere off the main routes where we could stay until she's strong enough to travel properly." Henry considered this. "Got a friend with a hunting cabin about 10 miles west of here. Remote, well supplied, might do the trick. Could we move her there safely?" "Wagon would be better than horseback," Henry mused. "I know someone who'd lend us one, no questions asked." They spent the next hour refining their plan. Henry would arrange for the wagon and supplies while Victor remained with Nora. They would leave before dawn, hopefully before any word of their presence could reach Frank. As night fell, Mrs. Caldwell brought them a simple dinner, which Victor ate while keeping vigil at Nora's bedside. Henry had gone to make the necessary arrangements, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts and the sleeping woman whose safety had become his primary concern. He studied her face in the lamplight, the delicate curve of her cheek, the soft line of her jaw. Even in sleep, there was a tension around her eyes as if part of her remained vigilant against danger. How long would it take for that vigilance to fade? How many peaceful nights before she truly believed herself safe? Nora stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Victor," she murmured drowsily. "I'm here," he assured her, leaning forward. "Water, please." He helped her drink, supporting her head with his hand. "How's the pain?" "Distant," she replied with a small smile. "Like it belongs to someone else." "That's the laudanum," Victor explained. "Doctor left more for when it wears off." She nodded, then frowned slightly. "I heard you and Henry talking. We're leaving tomorrow before dawn. Henry knows a safe place where you can recover properly." Nora's fingers found his, twining weakly around them. "Thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Victor said softly. "I do," she insisted. "You've given up everything to help me, your job, your safety." Her eyes, though clouded with medication, were sincere. "No one has ever put me first before." Victor squeezed her hand gently. "Get some more rest. We have an early start tomorrow." She settled back against the pillows, but continued to hold his hand as she drifted back to sleep. Victor remained beside her, unwilling to break the connection even after her grip relaxed in slumber. This is what it would be like, he thought, to care for someone, to be allowed to protect and cherish them. He'd never given much thought to settling down, building a life with someone. The trail had been his home, his work, his focus. But now, watching over Nora, he could imagine a different path. Henry returned late that evening with news that all arrangements were in place. They would depart at 4 in the morning before the town awakened. Mrs. Caldwell, who had been discreetly informed of their true situation, had agreed to provide food for their journey and would help prepare Nora for travel. The remainder of the night passed in fitful periods of rest for Victor, who dozed in the chair beside Nora's bed, waking at the slightest sound. Henry slept on the floor near the door, his rifle close at hand. At the appointed hour, Mrs. Caldwell arrived to help Nora dress while the men loaded their belongings into the waiting wagon. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cold, the streets of Riverside silent except for the occasional barking dog. "Ready?" Victor asked as Henry helped him lift Nora, now bundled in warm blankets, into the wagon bed. They had arranged a makeshift bed of straw and quilts to cushion her during the journey. "Ready," she confirmed, though her face was taut with pain despite the laudanum doctor. Peterson had administered before their departure. They set off slowly, Victor driving the wagon while Henry rode ahead to scout the route. Mrs. Caldwell watched from her porch until they disappeared around the bend, a silent witness to their escape. The journey to the hunting cabin took most of the day, the wagon moving slowly over rough terrain to avoid jarring Nora's injury. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the pine forest surrounding the small log structure. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, a table with benches, and 2 small bedrooms. Henry immediately set about building a fire while Victor carried Nora inside, laying her gently on the bed in the larger of the 2 rooms. "Home sweet home," he said with an attempt at cheerfulness. "At least for the next week or so." Nora managed a smile despite her evident exhaustion. "It's perfect, truly." Over the next few days they established a routine. Henry, who knew the area well, would hunt and check his trap lines, bringing back fresh game for their meals. Victor tended to Nora, helping her exercise her healing leg as doctor. Peterson had instructed, reading to her from the small collection of books in the cabin, and generally doing everything possible to ensure her comfort. The forced proximity created an intimacy that was both comforting and challenging. Victor was acutely aware of Nora as a woman, her scent, the sound of her voice, the graceful movement of her hands. But he maintained a careful distance, mindful of her vulnerability and his own promise to give her time. On the 4th day, when Nora was feeling stronger, Victor helped her outside to sit on the cabin's small porch. The autumn air was bracing, the forest around them ablaze with color. "It's beautiful here," she observed, breathing deeply. "Peaceful." Victor settled beside her on the rough-hewn bench. "How's the leg today?" "Better," she replied. "Still painful, but I can feel it healing." She turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. "Victor, we need to talk about what happens next." He nodded, having expected this conversation. "Henry thinks you'll be strong enough to travel in another 3 or 4 days. From here, it's about a week's journey to Portland if we take it slow." "And then," she pressed, "then you'll meet the Bennetts. Good people, as I've said. Martha Bennett teaches at the local school. She can help you find similar work if that interests you." "And you?" Nora asked softly. "What will you do?" Victor looked out at the forest, avoiding her gaze. "Head back south, I suppose, find work. Even with Frank potentially looking for you." "Frank's quarrel is with you, not me," Victor pointed out. "Once you're safely settled, he'll have no reason to pursue me." Nora was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Unless you give him a reason." Victor turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Unless you stay with me," she clarified, her cheeks flushing. "In Oregon." The directness of her statement caught him off guard. "Nora, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted. "That I need time, that I'm vulnerable, that I'm mistaking gratitude for something else." Her eyes met his, steady and sure. "But you'd be wrong." Victor felt his carefully constructed resolve beginning to crumble. "Would I?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because while I am grateful more than I can ever express, that's not why I'm asking you to stay." "Then why?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Because in the midst of the worst time of my life, I found something unexpected." She reached for his hand, her touch light but certain. "I found a man who sees me, really sees me, not as a possession or a burden, but as a person of value." Victor's throat tightened with emotion. "You are valuable, Nora, more than you know." "So are you," she replied. "And I'm not ready to lose you just because we've reached some arbitrary destination." He looked down at their joined hands. "I don't want you to feel beholden to me." "I don't," she assured him. "If anything, this journey has reminded me of my own strength. I survived Frank. I can survive on my own if needed." She squeezed his hand gently. but I'd rather not have to." Victor met her gaze, searching for any sign of uncertainty. Instead, he found only clarity and determination, the same qualities that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Starting over somewhere new, and Frank might still find us." "Nothing worth having comes easy," she replied with a small smile. "And as for Frank, I'm not afraid anymore, not with you beside me." The certainty in her voice broke through the last of his resistance. Victor reached out, cupping her cheek in his palm. "Are you sure, Nora? Truly sure?" In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as he responded. Victor's arms encircled her, drawing her closer, mindful of her injury but unable to resist the pull between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since Johnson's Creek," he admitted. Nora laughed softly. "I've wanted you to do that since Sierra City." They were still holding each other when Henry returned from checking his traps. The old prospector took one look at them and grinned knowingly. "About time," he commented, heading into the cabin with his day's catch. The next few days passed in a blur of healing and planning. Nora grew stronger each day, the proper medical care and rest doing what months of neglect had prevented. Victor and Henry prepared for the journey to Oregon, gathering supplies and studying maps to determine the safest route. And in the evenings, after Henry tactfully retired to the second bedroom, Victor and Nora talked about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west after the war, his years on the trail. She shared memories of her life before Frank, her dreams of perhaps one day teaching or writing. Their physical relationship remained chaste out of necessity and respect for her healing body, but the emotional connection between them deepened with each passing day. By the time they were ready to depart for Oregon, Victor knew with certainty that what they had found together was real and lasting. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold. They loaded the wagon with their belongings and the additional supplies Henry had procured. The old prospector had decided to accompany them all the way to Portland, a decision that relieved Victor given the potential danger of the journey. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had sheltered them during Nora's recovery, she paused on the porch, gazing back at the simple structure. "I'll always remember this place," she said softly. "It's where I found myself again." Victor slipped his arm around her waist. "It's where we found each other." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Are you ready for this, for us?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," he assured her. With Henry leading the way on horseback, they set off toward the north, toward Oregon, toward their future together. The journey would be long and not without risk, but Victor felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together. They traveled steadily for 5 days, keeping to less traveled routes and camping each night in secluded locations. Nora's strength continued to improve, though Victor insisted she ride in the wagon rather than on horseback to avoid stressing her healing leg. On the 6th day, as they approached a small settlement near the Oregon border, Henry returned from scouting ahead with troubling news. "Riders coming from the south," he reported, 4 of them moving fast. Victor's hand instinctively moved to his revolver. "Frank? Can't be sure from this distance," Henry replied, "but they're pushing their horses hard like men with purpose." They quickly moved the wagon off the main trail, concealing it behind a stand of trees. Victor helped Nora down, leading her to a sheltered position while Henry secured the horses. "What's the plan if it is Frank?" Nora asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We stand our ground," Victor replied grimly. 3 against 4 aren't bad odds. 3, she questioned. Victor looked pointedly at the revolver holstered at her hip, the one she'd taken from Frank's collection. I've seen you practicing with that. I trust your aim. A small smile touched her lips despite the gravity of their situation. My brothers would be proud. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the sound of approaching riders reached them. Victor peered cautiously through the trees, his breath catching as he recognized the lead rider, Frank O'Malley, his face set in lines of rage and determination. It's him, Victor confirmed quietly. And 3 others probably hired guns. Nora nodded, her face pale but resolved as she checked her revolver. What now? We wait, Victor decided. See if they pass by, but Frank and his companions didn't pass by. They slowed as they approached the area where the wagon had left the main trail, one of the men pointing to the fresh tracks in the soft earth. They've spotted our trail, Henry murmured. No avoiding this confrontation now. Victor's mind raced, considering their options. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of cover and surprise. Henry, circle around to the left. I'll take the right. Nora, stay here with the wagon. You've got the best protected position. As Victor moved into position, he heard Frank's voice carrying through the trees. I know you're there, Nora. Show yourself, you ungrateful whore. You and that cowboy who stole you from me. Victor signaled to Henry to hold position. Perhaps they could still avoid bloodshed if Frank could be reasoned with, though he held little hope of that. No one stole me, Frank, Nora called back, her voice remarkably steady. I left of my own free will. A bark of harsh laughter answered her. Like hell you did. No wife leaves unless some other man turns her head. Show yourself, both of you, or we start shooting into those trees. There's no need for violence, Victor responded, keeping his position hidden. The lady has made her choice. Go back to California, Frank. That's not how this works, Cowboy, Frank snarled. She's my wife, my property by law, and you're nothing but a thief. The law doesn't give you the right to beat her, Victor countered, to break her bones and her spirit. There was a moment of tense silence. Then Frank spoke again, his voice dangerously calm. I'm going to count to 3. If you both don't come out with your hands up, my men will start shooting. 1. Victor glanced toward Nora, hoping to signal her to stay down, but she was already moving, limping forward into the small clearing, her revolver held steadily before her. 2. I'm here, Frank, she called clearly, but I'm not coming back with you, not today, not ever. Frank's face contorted with rage as he spotted her among the trees. He raised his own pistol. You'll come back or you'll die right here. No, Nora replied simply. I won't. And with that, she fired a clean shot that caught Frank in the shoulder of his gun arm. He howled in pain and outrage, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the ground as he dropped it. The clearing erupted into chaos. Frank's companions drew their weapons, but Victor and Henry were ready. Their coordinated fire dropped one man immediately and sent the others diving for cover. Get back to the wagon, Victor shouted to Nora as he moved to a new position, trying to draw fire away from her. But Nora held her ground, firing again as one of Frank's men attempted to flank their position. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to force him back. The gunfight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of Frank's companions lay dead, and the 3rd had fled on horseback. Frank himself was wounded but alive, disarmed and kneeling in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Victor approached him cautiously, his revolver trained on Frank's chest. It's over, O'Malley. Frank looked up, his face twisted with hatred. Shoot me then if you've got the stomach for it. Killing's not my way, Victor replied steadily. Not even for scum like you. Nora limped forward to stand beside Victor, her own revolver still aimed at her husband. You'll go back to Sierra City, Frank. You'll file for divorce on grounds of desertion, and you'll never come looking for me again." Frank spat on the ground. "Or what? You'll shoot me." "I don't think you've got it in you, Nora. You're weak. Always have been." "I'm stronger than you ever knew," she replied calmly. "Strong enough to leave, strong enough to shoot you once, and strong enough to do it again if necessary." Something in her voice, a certainty, a finality, seemed to reach Frank in a way threats couldn't. He stared at her for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. "You've changed," he observed, "gotten hard." "I've gotten free," she corrected. "Now do we have an agreement?" Frank's eyes darted between Nora and Victor, calculating. Finally, he nodded grudgingly. "Fine. You're not worth the bullet it would take to put you down anyway." Victor resisted the urge to strike the man for his final insult. Instead, he kept his voice level. "Your horse is over there. Mount up and ride south. Don't stop until you're back in California if we ever see you again." "You won't," Frank interrupted, struggling to his feet. He looked directly at Nora, his expression unreadable. "Goodbye, wife." "Goodbye, Frank," Nora replied softly. They watched as he mounted his horse awkwardly, favoring his wounded shoulder, and rode away without looking back. Only when he had disappeared from view did Victor lower his weapon. "You think he'll honor the agreement?" Henry asked skeptically. "I think he values his life too much to risk it," Victor replied, "but we'll be vigilant just in case." He turned to Nora, concerned by her pallor. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd be capable of shooting someone, even him." "You did what was necessary," Victor assured her. "You protected yourself and us." "It wasn't just that," she admitted. "It was finishing something, proving to myself that I truly am free of him." Victor understood. This confrontation had been inevitable, a final severing of the ties that had bound Nora to her past. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they returned to the wagon. "What about them?" Henry asked, gesturing toward the bodies of Frank's companions. "We'll bury them properly," Victor decided. "Then move on. We're still a day's ride from the border." The grim task took several hours. By the time they were ready to continue their journey, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail ahead. "We should make camp," Henry suggested. "Start fresh in the morning." Victor agreed, noting Nora's exhaustion after the day's events. They found a sheltered spot a mile further along the trail, well away from the scene of the confrontation. That night, as they sat around the campfire, Nora seemed unusually quiet. Victor respected her need for silence, understanding that she was processing all that had happened. It wasn't until Henry had retired to his bedroll and they were alone that she finally spoke. "I keep seeing his face," she said softly. "Not angry or hateful, but defeated. I never saw him look that way before." "Because you never stood up to him before," Victor suggested gently. "Perhaps." She gazed into the fire. "Is it strange that I feel? Not satisfaction exactly, but resolution." "No," Victor assured her. "You closed a chapter today, painfully but definitely." She nodded, then turned to him with unexpected intensity. "I need you to understand something, Victor. What I feel for you, it's not because you rescued me or protected me today. It began before that, when you first showed me kindness in Sierra City, when you saw me as a person, not a possession." Victor took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I know that, Nora, do you?" she pressed. "Because I need you to be certain. I don't want there to be any doubts between us, any shadows." "No doubts," he affirmed, lifting her hand to his lips. "No shadows." She smiled then, the tension leaving her body. "Good. Because I love you, Victor Elliott, and I intend to build a life with you that contains no echoes of the one I left behind." The simple declaration stole his breath. He had known, of course, felt it in her touch, seen it in her eyes, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way that touched his soul. "I love you too, Nora," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "More than I thought possible." They sealed their declarations with a kiss tender at first, then deepening with the promise of all that awaited them. When they finally parted, Nora rested her head against his shoulder, content in the silence that followed. The remainder of their journey to Oregon passed without further incident. They crossed the border 2 days after the confrontation with Frank, all of them feeling a sense of relief as they left California behind. Portland welcomed them with autumn rains and the promise of new beginnings. The Bennetts proved to be as warm and welcoming as Victor had described, opening their home to the travelers while they established themselves. Within a month, Victor had found work at a local ranch, while Nora, her leg now fully healed, began assisting Martha Bennett at the schoolhouse. Henry, to everyone's surprise, decided to stay in Portland as well, taking a room in town and finding work as a night watchman at the lumber mill. "Too old to go back to prospecting," he claimed, though Victor suspected the old man had simply grown fond of their company. As winter settled over the Pacific Northwest, bringing short days and long nights, Victor and Nora's relationship deepened. They spoke often of marriage, but both agreed to wait until spring, partly to give Nora time to obtain the divorce she demanded from Frank, and partly to honor their promise to themselves to proceed with deliberation rather than haste. Besides, Nora pointed out one evening as they sat by the fire in the small cabin Victor had rented at the edge of town, "I'm enjoying this courtship. I never had one before." Victor laughed, pulling her closer on the settee they shared. "Is that what we're doing, courting?" "Indeed," she replied with mock solemnity. "Very properly, too, except for the fact that we're alone, unchaperoned, and you keep kissing me." "Scandalous," he agreed, proceeding to do just that. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the paperwork confirming her divorce, they wasted no time in planning their wedding. It was a simple ceremony in the town's small church, attended by the Bennetts, Henry, and a few friends they'd made over the winter months. Nora wore a dress of pale blue, not white, she'd insisted. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not," with wildflowers in her hair. Victor, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in his new suit. "Never thought I'd see the day," Henry commented as they shared a drink after the ceremony. "A confirmed bachelor like you settled down with a wife." "Best decision I ever made," Victor replied, watching as Nora chatted with Martha Bennett across the room. "Though I still wake up some mornings wondering if it's all a dream." "No dream," Henry assured him. "Just life as it's meant to be lived with someone to share it." That night, in the privacy of their cabin, husband and wife affirmed their vows in the most intimate way possible. For Nora, it was a revelation, physical love as an expression of tenderness and mutual desire rather than obligation or dominance. For Victor, it was a homecoming he'd never expected to find. As they lay together afterward, Nora's head resting on his chest, Victor marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first encounter on the streets of Sierra City to this peaceful cabin in Oregon, a path marked by danger and pain, yes, but also by courage and hope. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin. "That happiness is a strange thing," he replied. "It can find you when you least expect it." "Even in the midst of darkness," she agreed softly. Victor kissed the top of her head. "No more darkness for you, Nora Elliott, I promise you that." "No," she murmured sleepily. "Only light from here forward, for both of us." The years that followed proved the truth of her words. They built a life together in Oregon, eventually purchasing a small ranch outside Portland, where Victor could work with horses, his true passion, while Nora continued teaching at the local school. Their home became known for its warmth and hospitality, a gathering place for friends old and new. Henry remained a fixture in their lives, a self-appointed guardian and later an honorary grandfather to the children who eventually blessed their union. First came Thomas, a strong boy with his father's quiet nature and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, Emily arrived, bringing with her all the joy and mischief a daughter could offer. Through it all, the challenges of building a ranch, the sleepless nights with newborns, the everyday triumphs and setbacks of married life, Victor and Nora remained steadfast in their devotion to each other. The shadows of the past occasionally resurfaced, a nightmare that would wake Nora in a cold sweat, a moment of irrational fear when Victor was late returning from town, but together they faced these ghosts and banished them. News reached them in the summer of 1882 that Frank O'Malley had died in a saloon brawl in Sacramento. The information, conveyed in a brief letter from an old acquaintance in Sierra City, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, interrupting breakfast with the children. Nora read the letter twice, her expression unreadable. Then she folded it carefully and set it aside. "Frank is dead," she said simply. Victor studied her face across the breakfast table. "How do you feel about that?" She considered his question thoughtfully, aware of their children's curious eyes upon her. "I feel nothing," she finally replied. "It's like news about a stranger." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, she elaborated. "There was a time when I hated him so much it consumed me. Then a time when I feared him more than death itself. But somewhere along the way, perhaps that day in the clearing, perhaps later, he stopped having any power over me at all." Victor pulled her into his arms, understanding completely. "That's the truest freedom of all." "Yes," she agreed, resting her head against his chest. "And it's a freedom we found together." As they stood there in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the life they had built, Victor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first glimpse of a bruised face on a dusty street to this, a love that had healed wounds, crossed boundaries, and created something beautiful from the ashes of pain. "You ever wonder," Nora asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't spoken to me that day in Sierra City?" Victor tightened his embrace. "I try not to think about it. Some paths are too dark to contemplate, even in hindsight. I like to think we would have found each other somehow," she mused, "that some connections are inevitable." "Perhaps," Victor conceded with a smile. "But I'm grateful we didn't have to test that theory." Nora looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the same love and certainty they had shown on their wedding day 5 years earlier. "As am I, husband, as am I." Outside their window, the Oregon night was peaceful, stars scattered across the sky like promises. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Victor and Nora Elliott stood as living testimony to the power of courage, the healing force of love, and the enduring strength of the human spirit to rise above its darkest hours into the light of newfound freedom.